The legacy of history, the Venetian factor, and this section should allow us to segue into a little more information on the Borgheses. We'll go step back into the past and then bring it up to date. All right. In 1582, the 40 or so families which controlled the vast fortunes and far-flung intelligence capabilities of Venice, extending even to Mongolia, which is where I am right now. Yes, they said the research. There's research that indicates that Genghis Khan was aided by these very intelligence capabilities of Venice, and I guess that assured the Venetians a more than fair cut of the revenues from the Silk Road, and it enabled Genghis Khan his spectacular military victories, or expedited them. Okay, so the 40 or so families split into two factions: the nuovi, the new houses or families, and the vecchi, the old houses. On the surface, the appellations seemed to refer to those families ennobled since the Serrata, the closing of the Grand Council in 1297, who were called the Nuovi, whereas those who had already held titles of nobility were the Vecchi. In fact, the upheaval was the result of the establishment of sovereign nation-states for the first time in history as a consequence of the Renaissance. The city-state of Venice, never more than 200,000 people, could not stand against the new powers that were coming into being, founded to promote the common good of their citizenry. The sheer numbers, the science and technology, the military power were too much for even the powerful and devious masters of La Serenissima, as Venice is famously called. And we see a legacy of that today, where they achieved a kind of, since they couldn't stop scientific progress, what they did was they decided they could control it. And as we see today, this monstrosity called the science is certainly the clearest and most disturbing example of this. It's not science, it's the science. It's the controlled scientific narrative. And this control goes back to, I think, this sensibility back then that Venetians could not compete honestly with these new powers, the new sovereign nation states, which I think the first, really you could argue the first one coming into being is Louis XI in France. But the idea that there are these sovereign nation states where the well-being of the citizenry is prioritized, and you have this almost unfettered pursuit of development. This was very threatening to the banking houses of Venice. So you see this same suspicion today when you talk about sustainable development. What do you mean? You mean development that is controlled very carefully by a technocracy that descends in an epistemological sense from these Venetians. Going on, the Nuovi realized that, notwithstanding the bloody religious warfare which Venice had unleashed in Europe following the failure of the League of Cambrai to defeat Venice in 1511, its days were ultimately numbered. They took several strategic, that was when all the nations, or all the territories of Europe, except for England, had all decided they had enough of Venice and its predatory banking practices and the destructive, absolutely plague-like effect it had on the economies and of the people throughout Europe. Whole economies just completely sunk. Very much using techniques and methodologies that are very much exactly in line with what we see from the IMF today. They took several strategic actions. First, under the leadership of Paolo Sarpi, they created the philosophy of empiricism as a sense-certainty-based fraud whose purpose was to destroy the creative method of Platonic hypothesizing. Second, also under Sarpi's leadership, they launched a fierce war against the Vatican, posing as the bastion of enlightened Europe against obscurantist Rome. Third, they brought the newly emerging Protestant powers, England and Holland, whose rise came largely thanks to Venice itself, into what had always been the cornerstone of Venice's fortunes, its trade with the East Indies. The Venetians founded the British East India Company in 1600, so the Venetian banking houses moved into Geneva to Amsterdam and then ultimately settled on London. And so you see the Venetians, at an earlier time, they had something called the Levant Company. And the British East India Company is basically just a spin-off or a duplicate of the Levant Company. So the Venetians founded the British East India Company in 1600 from a merger of the England-based Venice Company and the Turkey Company, and the Dutch East India Company in 1602, and the wealth derived from this trade helped create or enrich a number of great aristocratic families in both countries along the Venetian model. And, as LaRouche has often emphasized, the British East India Company became the foremost power in the world in 1763, in the wake of the British-rigged 7 Years' War among the contending European powers in the classic Venetian divide-and-conquer method. Fourth, they moved much of their fortunes and even some of their families north, first into Holland and then into England, where they created what would be known in the 18th century as the Venetian Party. As part of this, they established the famous Wisselbank Exchange Bank of Amsterdam in 1609, the most powerful bank in the world, modeled upon their own private patrician-controlled banks, followed by the Bank of England in 1694, both serving as the models upon which all central banks have been established since then. In part because of these redeployments, Venice's financial power remained huge well into the 18th century, as did its legendary spy system, brilliantly chronicled by Friedrich Schiller in his novella Der Geisterseher, the Ghost Seer. And American intelligence operative James Fenimore Cooper, in his novel The Bravo. Barings Bank in England, the Bank of the British East India Company, for instance, was the vehicle for Venetian funds in Britain and was at the center of the Venetian Party, together with the Bank of England. Napoleon Bonaparte had been partially sponsored and funded by Venetian and Genoese families. The Genoese Princess Pallavicini of that era famously punned that her family owned la buona parte, the best part of him. It's interesting, I'm recalling how Princess Diana noted, I guess with some measure of secrecy, divulging this to someone I don't know I can't recall the full story, but that she and the queen would go to visit the matriarch of the Pallavicini family, and these visits were top secret. I guess Queen Elizabeth was paying homage or offering tribute to the more senior, more powerful head of the Pallavicini family, and this you can see how far this dynamic goes back. Back to Napoleon. His Corsican family had been retainers for the Genoese and Venetian nobility for centuries, and, as noted above, his favorite sister married a Borghese. When Napoleon's ravages had ended, Count Giovanni Capodistria, a Venetian nobleman acting as a government minister of Russia, almost single-handedly wrote the essential documents issued by the 1814-1815 Congress of Vienna, which established the ultra-reactionary Holy Alliance. Capodistria also pulled together the modern nation of Switzerland, in part as a repository for Venetian family funds, the fondi, which were also used to found several insurance companies in the late 18th century. These later included the Riunione Adriatica di Sicurità, RAS, and the Assicurazione Generale di Venezia e Trieste, which I think is the largest insurance company in the world, and it may even sort of set the agenda for insurance companies all around the world. This looks quite interesting. Let's just read this note quickly. The extraordinary financial power which Venice still commanded in the 18th century was documented by the Venetian nobleman Carlo Antonio Marin, historian of Venice Frederick Lake, and others. Its European-wide cultural warfare and espionage system was also still highly effective, as evidenced in the international campaign of the Paris-based Venetian abbot Antonio Conti to attempt to destroy the reputation of the great scientist Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. An agent of Venice's ruling Council of Ten, Count Cagliostro, Joseph Balsamo, organized the 1785 affair of the Queen's necklace, the scandal which, as Napoleon observed, was the opening act of the French Revolution, an event financed and run out of Britain. Well, I would argue that it was, in fact, being financed and run out of Geneva through Britain. Still, another notorious Venetian spy of the same era was Casanova, who reported directly to the Inner Three of the hooded, black-robed Council of Ten. The scarlet-robed chief of the Three was known as the Inquisitor, and in Venice it was understood that the 10 will send you to the torture chamber, but the 3 will send you to your grave. Schiller chose to set his masterful portrayal of the methods of the Venetian intelligence service as well as its Europe-wide reach in the 18th century. He clearly was not writing of a merely historical matter, nor was the patriotic American intelligence agent James Fenimore Cooper in his portrait written several decades later, though Cooper set his tale centuries earlier. During the American Revolution, Venice put its still considerable fleet at the service of the British. That's new to me, but it doesn't surprise me at all. And in that little it's not really a footnote. It's a rather big deal, I think. But you see how what we might call imperialism has long been at war with the sovereign nation state, especially the very dangerous one that emerged with the American Revolution, which put forth all sorts of very threatening ideas that needed to be squelched, subverted, as they were during the French Revolution, to make sure that the American ideas would not spread throughout Europe. Because if you recall, the original impulse for the French Revolution was concretized, or was authored through a kind of cooperative effort with the founders of the American Republic and some of the French visionaries who were looking ahead to to being able to transition to a constitutional monarchy. And of course, the British were very aware that the American revolutionary ideas were finding fertile ground in France, and then as a result, they were able to commandeer, to hijack the French Revolution and turn it into the sort of the Jacobin nightmare that we're all familiar with. Let's go ahead, though. At the turn of the 20th century, the ancients of Venice, although diminished, still commanded important financial and intelligence power, both on their own behalf, but also because they deployed as part of the British and subsequently Anglo-American dominated world, which their ancestors had created in the wake of the... Yes, because, America did not stay independent. I mean, even after the Paris Treaty in 1783, America was under constant attack and infiltration and attempts at being reconquered by the British, which led to then, the War of 1812, which then later the Civil War, which was in a sense, in a very real sense, we were fighting again for sovereignty and for freedom. And by that point, the French had been aligned through, following the French Revolution. France was then steered into alignment with the British, which is why the Americans found themselves facing both the French and threats from Britain and France during the American Civil War. And then later you had a kind of golden era of the American system in which the American philosophy, if you will, of progress and development began to offer the world hope that there was a viable alternative to imperialism. And you saw the American technical know-how and technology being transported and transplanted to Germany, China, Japan, Russia, and this was all very, very threatening to the British, which leads to World War I. So that's why, it says here subsequently the Anglo-American. So this is once the Americans had been clawed back into British control, which is what we're looking at today. I think probably with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, then you had the complete sort of invisible coup. It was a coup of sorts that people were not aware of the real meaning of it. And then you see, in my view, you have America simply behaving as a sort of a military wing of the British Empire. But anyway, going on. In the wake of the split redeployments of 1582, they cloned themselves and their institutions and methods to dominate northern Protestant, often Freemasonic Europe, while they still maintained their power in the historic seats of control in the formerly Habsburg-ruled southern, more Catholic portions of Europe, in particular in Italy and Spain and in the Church at Rome. They played a crucial role in organizing the Balkan Wars, which laid the immediate basis for World War I, for which Britain's King Edward VII had schemed for decades. In the early 20th century, a group of Venetian financier patricians led by Count Piero Foscari of the ancient family of Venetian doges established a number of companies and banks. Chief among the latter was the Banca Commerciale Italiana, Italiana, BCI, and in particular its Venice branch. Through Foscari, though Foscari was the undisputed leader of this Venetian group, its most public figure was Giuseppe Volpi, later known as Count Giuseppe Volpi di Misurata, after his probably one of the earliest of the Synarchists, after his early 1920s rule of Italian-occupied Libya on behalf of Mussolini, acting as the point man for an international financial syndicate, including the Bank of England, the Mellons, the House of Morgan. Volpi organized Mussolini's rise to power precisely as Schacht did later for those same forces in installing Hitler in power. And I think you'll see the British also behind the rise of Mussolini, perhaps Churchill. Volpi was Mussolini's finance minister from 1925 to July of 1928, following which he became a member of the Grand Council of Fascism, and in 1934, chairman of the Industrialists' Association. He designed Mussolini's economic doctrine of corporatism along the model originally laid down by Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvedre, 1842-1909, the founder of the Synarchy of Empire movement and the inspiration for the Martinist Freemasonic lodges through which the modern Synarchy was organized. Nominally a tripartite pact among corporations, the state, and labor, it was basically ruled by corporations, i.e., private financiers. In 1929, Volpi oversaw the famous Concordat between Italy and the Vatican, in which, among other things, Italy recognized the Vatican as a sovereign state and paid financial compensation for the papal states in central Italy, which it had taken over in the second half of the 19th century. The compensation was 1,550 billion liras, a sizable sum at the time. There's Count Giuseppe Volpi di Misurata, second from the left. Fascinating character. He organized Mussolini's rise to power on behalf of the Synarchist financial syndicate, including the Bank of England, the Mellons, and the Morgans. One Bernardino Nogara was chosen, seemingly out of the blue, to manage this fortune. The prominent American diplomat George Kennan wrote in his memoirs 1925 to 1950 about the extraordinary power commanded by Nogara, a so-called mystery man, an Italian banker by the name of Bernardino Nogara, I have to check, had been granted sole control by the papacy over the entire fortune of 92.1 million the Church had received from the Lateran Treaty. No Vatican official, not even the Pope himself, was allowed veto power over Nogara's decision, Nogara probably, nor would the banker permit any religious or doctrinal policies of the Church to stand in his way. Never before in modern church history had anyone been granted such sweeping authority by the church, not even popes themselves, with all their supposed infallibility, let alone a layman and a non-Catholic Jewish, as in Nogara's case. Unquote. Fascinating character. Boy, that's an amazing subject right there, that figure. A kind of portal into a confluence of a whole lot of interests and agendas. His impact on the church may also be judged by the epitaph delivered upon his death in 1958 by the head of the SMOM in America, New York's Cardinal Spellman. Quote, "Next to Jesus Christ, the greatest thing to happen to the Catholic Church is Bernardino Nogara." Unquote. Well, whether or not he was Jewish, the mystery man was no mystery at all. Nogara had been managing director for a Venetian firm run by Foscari Volpi et al. In the Ottoman Empire already back in 1901. Reflecting his Venetian ties, Nogara became Italian's representative on the Ottoman Debt Council, sort of IMF, for the Ottoman Empire, whose purpose was to bleed it and carve it up. The British-sponsored Freemasonic lodges in Salonika, from which the Young Turks were organized to oust the Sultan. The Freemason Volpi was intimately involved in the coup, as undoubtedly was Nogara. Nogara was it sounds like Japanese. It's probably Nogara, I'm sorry, guys. Was the head of the BCI branch in Istanbul and was Volpi's chief intelligence agent in the Ottoman Empire until that empire disappeared in the World War I, which Volpi and his friends had done so much to help organize through the Masonic lodges and through Venice's ancient financial and familial ties with the Balkans. After Nogara had been chosen delegate of the Special Administration, later known as the Administration of the Holy See Patrimony, to oversee the investment of the wealth flowing from the Concordat, he became vice president of the BCI, upon whose post-war premises the P2 Lodge would be founded. Nogara established intimate financial relations with the cream of the Synarchy, including the Paris and London Rothschilds, Credit Suisse, Hambros Bank in London, JP Morgan Bank, and the Bankers Trust Company in New York, and the Paris-centered Banque de Paris et des Pays-Bas, Paribas, a stronghold of the Synarchy in France in the interwar and post-war years. He also promoted a cadre of uomini di fiducia, men of confidence, Vatican, lay, Catholic, or even non-Catholic financiers who would oversee the enormous new Vatican holdings. Nogara bought large or controlling interests in dozens of major banks, utilities, insurance companies, and industrial corporations, even as he reorganized previous Vatican holdings, such as the Catholic banks, which were generally Catholic-owned and which did business with the church and its officials as opposed to the secular bank. So we might as well finish this up. I think what I'll do, because this is getting a bit long, is make another video in the next few days on the Borgheses and maybe a bit on the SMOM, and also some, I think, very, very important info on Gladio, the origins of Gladio. Noting a few, let's see, The most important of these men of confidence was Prince Massimo Spada, a Vatican title, who had been inducted as a Knight of Malta in 1944. Spada either chaired or sat on the board of an astounding array of the holdings Nogara purchased, noting only a few of the more important in their capital as of the late 1960s. These included, he was vice president of the Banco di Roma, one of Italy's largest banks, historically associated with Rome's black nobility, and sat on the board of its Swiss subsidiary, Italy's biggest domestic gas company, Società Italiana per il Gas, 37,412 million liras, president of the Trieste-based Riunione Adriatica di Sicurezza insurance company, 4.320 billion liras, vice president and managing director of the Assicuratrice Italiana. Let's see, we get into the vice president of both the Unione Subalpina di Assicurazione and Lavoro e Securità, Shell Italiana, the sovereign subsidiary of Royal Dutch Shell. So there's a bridge with the Dutch nobility. Vice president of the Istituto Bancario Italiano, and on and on. This gets a bit tedious. President of the Finanziaria Industriale e Commerciale, president of the Banca Cattolica del Veneto, board of directors of Finsider, a state-controlled holding company, part of IRI, and it just doesn't stop. Take a look at that. Alfa Romeo, Alitalia. With all this enormous power and despite his leading position in the Catholic Church, Spada sponsored the rise of Michele Sindona as one of the Vatican's men of confidence. His choice was most peculiar not only because Sindona had been a fascist during the war, but because during that time he had made connections through American OSS-connected mobster Vito Genovese to the Inserillo and Gambino crime families for whom he laundered heroin money. Reviewing the picture sketched above, we thus find that an intricate financial web originally woven by Count Giuseppe Volpi di Misurata and his Venetian aristocratic friends and associates such as Bernardino Nogara had grown by 1960 to include Michele Sindona, who financed one of Gladio's most important assets, the Black Prince Borghese. Sindona also was, quote, one of the channels, perhaps the most important, to back up the attempted coups of 1970 to 1974, as Green and Massignani put it. Sindona later sponsored the rise of Banco Ambrosiano's Roberto Calvi, the P2 financier who was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London in 1982 in a ritualistic Masonic murder, and when the P2 financial scandals exploded, one of those arrested as a key figure in them was Massimo Spada, the protege of Volpi's friend Nogara. The membership of the ostensibly Catholic and therefore ostensibly anti-Freemasonic Rome-centered SMOM overlapped with the Freemasonic, presumably anti-clerical P2 Lodge. They were the twins of Italy's Venice-centered oligarchy. That sounds really complex, but we do go into it, and we will be going into it. And if you understand that all the strings are being pulled by, I think mostly by the British monarchy, then somehow it all kind of, oh, I see how, these factions that would seem to be at odds are actually working in concert with one another. Again, we go back, we refer to the killing of Aldo Moro, which was by astute observers and people in the know understood where this was coming from, the British Crown, and then their intermediaries and their agents like Henry Kissinger. So understanding that, it's not quite as complex, I think. The privately run international monetary system is now collapsing. Okay, right. And the desperate financial oligarchy is trying to consolidate a new worldwide fascism driven by the new waves of terror, such as 9/11 and the March 11, 2004 train bombings in Madrid. In this context, much of the superstructure of Gladio is finally being exposed by those opposed to this new fascism. These exposés are essential. But we must go still deeper to lift the veil from the ancients and through them to the Synarchy to which they've given birth, of which they remain a crucial component.